Thanks for joining us. So just by way of quick background, wanted to tell you a little bit about, for those of you that are not familiar with Native, give a quick background, and then I'll let these guys take it in a bit further, specifically talking about what we're going to be talking about is unlearning the kind of peer-to-peer traditional marketplace, specifically focused on multiple contributor models where you have multiple people contributing to the ultimate delivery on the supply side for singular delivery on the demand side, and defensibility and scale with that type of model. Before we go too deep into the model itself, just very quick background on us. So Native is an on-demand marketplace for market research. We effectively have a fleet of workers, locals in about 35 countries, operating in about 16 languages that can be tasked on demand to do anything from public opinion polling to looking at product and pricing and availability, anything where it would be additive or useful to have a human there in person at scale in any language around the world. We effectively, in the consumer packaged goods domain, we work with fast-moving consumer goods companies on a lot of the kinds of data that otherwise traditional market research providers would be providing, so pricing, product availability, but at a fraction of the cost and time through a distributed model. So just quick background on us. So I'm co-founder and CEO based in our New York office. To my right is Megan Jansch. So Megan joined us from Uber, where she launched and managed a number of Uber's operations in Latin America. She's based in our Bogota office, manages our operations for Latin America and across all of the Americas. And Thibaut Chevalier, to my far right, also joined us from Uber, where he was in Uber France. And manages our operations for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So in particular, I'm going to hand this over to them in a minute to talk a little bit more about their experience in kind of unwinding the more traditional kind of Uber or more traditional peer-to-peer marketplace model and some of the things they've been learning. So exactly what we do, because this is important, not so much for you to know what we do, but to understand in context what it is that we're going to be talking about from a model perspective, is we have effectively like a SurveyMonkey type interface. A user logs in, types in a series of questions. So I'm Pepsi and I want to know, I'm rolling out a new product in 5,000 retail markets in 3 different countries. And I want to see whether or not my marketing material and whether or not the product that I'm rolling out is in store. I'd go in, type in a series of questions, kind of SurveyMonkey style, and then upload the addresses of the locations. So over the 5,000 stores that I want people to go to. Then goes into a global dispatching system, very similar kind of to a rideshare type application, where we can see in real time the locations of our people in these markets, local to those stores. We then review and then approve those tasks. Locals then compete amongst themselves to go perform on the tasks. As they go into the store, they capture the data, whatever it is that you've asked them to do. So again, pricing, product availability, consumer insights, or public opinion polling, effectively anything where you would want many, many people at scale collecting this data. As it then rolls back in, we verify the data as close to real time as we can through a variety of different methods. And then it rolls back into real-time maps, dashboard, and statistics. And the net effect from a consumer experience perspective, if I'm Pepsi, rather than going to a traditional consulting firm that would recruit a bunch of people, train them up for 3 to 5 days, put them around the conference room table, pay them daily wages, send them out to the locations to collect the data. We'd have a back and forth from a consulting model as to what questions to ask, how to analyze it, how to collect it, and then a separate quality control team. We've effectively removed the middleman directly between the brand that has the question or the organization that has the question and the locals that are actually capturing the data.
also means that so we have multiple contributors to one task. So it could. Is that fine? Okay. So it also means that we can have multiple offers for only one task. So if I come back to my example of 1,000 data points, we can basically have 1,000 different offers and one offers for every collector. And also those offers could be dynamic. So it could be $3 in the morning to go and check the prices in the 7-Eleven down the street, and could be $7 in the afternoon, depending on how the task is going, and it's completely dynamic. And to us, this has a lot of implications. The first one being that we are not a take rate. We don't have a take rate margin, so we don't see our margin as a take rate, which is very different from a lot of marketplaces. And of course, this non-transparent margin take rate allows us to have much higher margins that we usually see in marketplaces. And of course, it's easier also to manage the relation with our collectors because we offer them 100% of the offered price, and they have no idea of how much we charge the clients. The second thing is that we have dynamic margins, and this is very important because, as Matt said, we are having very different and various data requests. So the one-off price that is paid by the client is assessed with our experience of the market, and especially the number of collectors that we have in each market. How hard the data request is to be fulfilled, and the volume. But we always prioritize the delivery, and so we can have variable margin between two projects, and we can make the margin evolve during the project to make sure that we fulfill the need of the client, which this is something that we couldn't do if it was not a decoupled pricing. Finally, of course, for the client, it's easier because it's a one-off pricing, and you all know how annoying it could be in some marketplace when the price is surging. So we have a set price at the beginning, and then we can make evolve or margin. I leave the stage to
Perfect.
Megan.
Thank you. So I'm going to speak about the last 2 points. The second point being about our intermediated quality process. So in a typical marketplace, everyone has become accustomed to the 5-star rating. And while that is effective in some contexts, for us, it's important to understand that first, from a content perspective, we're delivering data. And therefore, it can't be great 9 times out of 10 and then kind of all right that 10th time, and then you're still going to come back for more. That's irrelevant. So for us, the quality is our number one priority. If we fail on quality, that at any point, that kind of corrupts our value proposition to clients. So ensuring that our quality is our first priority and that we are instilling confidence in our quality process is incredibly important. So the 5-star rating is not really relevant because given the multi-contributor approach, our supply side and our demand side do not directly interact with each other. It's not an experience and interaction. But beyond that, it's because it's multiple contributors, they also wouldn't be evaluating one person. They would have to evaluate across everyone that contributed to creating that data set. And so there's just naturally that lack of interaction and just dispersing that work across multiple people. There's really no place for that. So taking kind of those 2 points into consideration, what we do instead, in lieu of the 5-star rating, but also in order to prioritize quality beyond just an experience in a subjective way, we have actually developed a process where we have our own quality scoring based on many other data points. And we're essentially able to filter out low quality contributions in advance of delivering that to our clients. So there's also a sequencing component to this. If you're taking an Uber ride and you don't have a great experience, or you do, you give that 5-star rating at the end. You've already had that experience. It's already influenced your perception of the platform. For us, we are reviewing every contribution on our platform in advance of including that contribution in the data set as the deliverable. So what's important there is that even if you have a great contributor, a great person, they might do great work 99% of the time, but you still want to be able to capture that one entry where they were having a bad day or they made a honest mistake, and therefore we are filtering out effectively those low quality contributions, not just low quality contributors, but their specific contributions. We filter them out before those actually become part of the data set. So if you go to the next slide. How do we do this? I'm going to be intentionally a little bit ambiguous about this because this is kind of our secret sauce, so to speak. Quality is incredibly important for differentiating ourselves to our competitors and actually making this marketplace work for all of the reasons that I mentioned around the content of actually delivering data. But at a high level, essentially, we are able to leverage all of the metadata in an app to not only measure what data points a collector contributed, but also all of the metadata around the process of collection, where they were, how quickly they delivered that, at what time of day, in what location. And so we are able to automate a lot of components of our quality review process. We systematically review every single entry on a survey, every single response that we receive, both the data points that are contributed as well as the metadata around the process that went behind that. We don't automate everything, or we automate everything, but we don't rely exclusively on the automation. So there's a learning curve around every use case that we are delivering for the first time, every geography that we're entering into. And so we also layer on an approach around manually auditing a certain percent of those entries to then influence and inform as well our automated processes and our automated rules, which behaviors we are screening for and deflecting, essentially. So if we go to the next one. There are a number of advantages to the fact that we've moved away from the 5-star rating, or just kind of the fact that we never could have relied on that. So first of all, with our quality scoring and the data points that we're putting into that, it's a more objective quality score. So one of the challenges in an Uber use case, for example, is that if you're subjectively scoring a human interaction, everyone comes with their own biases, which is not always fair to include in a rating process. And then additionally, people have their own kind of scale for what is a 5-star trip, what is a 3-star trip. There are a lot of cultural differences amongst countries that go into even what that natural scale is in one culture versus another, but it also varies based on the individual person. So it was a constant problem at Uber that a driver might feel that they were unfairly rated, and that is very demoralizing and frustrating from an engagement and satisfaction perspective. So our scoring is entirely objective. The second advantage there is that it's more targeted. So if you get out of an Uber, again, I'm going to keep using this example, but if you get out of an Uber and you give a low rating, you might be trying to communicate that you were frustrated with surge pricing or the long ETA or the inefficient route of the trip. And none of that is actually relevant for measuring the quality of a driver. And so for us, we're in our quality score, we've been very intentional about the components that we're actually monitoring and scoring so that our quality score is reflective of exactly the behaviors that we want to be measuring. And then third, it's actually complete data. We can essentially dial up or dial down the number of data points that we want to be included in our quality score and how many of those measurements we want on any given contribution, on any given person. Whereas with the 5-star rating system, one of the challenges is that you either have to force users every single time to give you that feedback, or you choose for it to be optional, and therefore you inevitably are missing data on many trips. So our quality score is complete, but we can also just dial up the number of data points that are included in that. And then finally, as I had mentioned before, the product is not actually used until that quality score is produced. So we can guarantee essentially what is our quality of delivery because we choose where the cutoff is. At what point are we comfortable that this was a well-collected entry and that we are confident that this data is valid? We can peg that and just hold our line. It's not a matter of having to prioritize between, what efficiencies do I gain if I kind of accept lower quality? We have to, by the nature of the content of what we're delivering, we have to set the bar very high and really hold that line with very high expectations of quality, but we can also systematically ensure that that's what we deliver without exception. So the final point that we wanted to make about kind of the third structural difference, or what we've turned into an advantage, is just about platform risk. So I'm going to speak briefly about two of the key risks that most marketplaces are trying to manage. One being quality delivery risk. So for all of the reasons that I just mentioned, we are able to ensure what the quality of our delivery is through that systematic review and just holding the line at where the threshold is for entries actually being included in the final data set, as well as the sequencing component of that. So we genuinely, by sequencing the quality scoring in advance of delivery, we ensure that it's not some of the time you get the right quality and some of the time you don't. There may be some trade-offs there with delivery times, but we have control over that and can make that decision because the quality score is sequenced in advance of the client receiving the data. And then the second risk factor, which many marketplaces are concerned about, is disintermediation. And so structurally speaking, because it's a multi-contributor approach and our demand side and our supply side do not directly interact with each other, there's really no risk of that. But more important than just kind of bypassing that risk structurally, I think it's a testament that our business model, we are adding significant value in the process. It's not simply putting demand and supply in touch with each other for the supplier to deliver all of the value. We are adding inherent value in our process of monitoring the collection through our metadata on the app, running it through our automated review process and verification process, and just even the dispatch piece around the marketplace to get access to the multiple contributors in the most efficient way possible, who are going to give you your deliverable, the full data set as quickly as possible. All of those components are value that we are adding as part of the process. It's not just value that's coming from a single supplier that then can be provided in an equal form offline, so to speak. So
that's a little bit about the model. So we mostly were talking about this in the context of native and what we do, but we view the model itself of having a multi-contributor model providing a lot of what Thibaut and Megan kind of ran through in terms of the risk, some of the pricing benefits gives you a lot of defensibility fundamentally as a model. So I think we're running low on time, so I don't know if we'd like to start Q&A if anyone has questions they'd like to dive into. Please.
So it sounds like one-to-one model obviously works when it's quite literally one-to-one, as the name suggests. But then this sort of model would work when it's 1 to n being very large. What about something where it's 1 to 2? So there's still some unbundling of the value that the 2 on one side are providing to the 1 on the other, but it's not necessarily so you can't dynamically price what each of those people is the 2 on that side are getting, because it's much more visible to each other.
Well, so
to repeat the
just to repeat,
yeah.
To summarize and repeat the question as best I can. So we discussed largely a one-to-many model. And there's the one-to-one model, but what about a 1 to 2 or a low-n model? So I'll take a cut at this, and then you guys can jump in as relevant. So I think a couple of dynamics there. So with respect to the number of n, so if it's 2, if it's 5, if it's 5,000, I think the n itself is different than the transparency that one makes the determination to provide, both on both sides of the marketplace, but also between the providers in the marketplace, because there's no discoverability for a provider. So in other words, in our case, a data collector, or one of the suppliers doesn't have the ability, say, like a TaskRabbit or something like that. There's no discoverability of what the other person's rate would be, right? So inherently, to the extent that what the buy side of the marketplace is purchasing is a unified product, the actual number of n is irrelevant, and the discoverability of pricing between the suppliers is also functionally relevant to the marketplace. So I'm not necessarily sure that, I mean, I think it would depend on whether or not those conditions held true. That is, does the buyer in fact care more about the end kind of unified product of that which they provide, rather than purely the service of the individual supplier. But if that were to hold true, I would think that that kind of imbalance and the lack of discoverability in pricing would still maintain similar characteristics, I would think.
I'm trying to think of an example, and the one that comes to mind, at least for a 1-to-2 model, would be certain translation services, for example, offer a secondary review. So it essentially gets dispatched to one supplier who completes the first version of the translation, and then a second supplier who does the proofreading, and that's considered an additional quality offering. So I think that in some cases, maybe it's something like that around sequencing actually what contribution would be happening if it's really a 1-to-2. Otherwise, I think, one to many could be anywhere from 1-to-2 to 1 to, an infinite number. I think that you can, it's more around the structural differences if you actually gain these types of advantages around it or not.
Yeah, the example I'm thinking of is it's ordered, buyer, seller process 1, seller process 2, and what I'm thinking of, not 1 and 2 happening at the same time.
Right, sequenced.
Any other questions? Yes.
So, are there any, you mentioned your quality process, are there any instances where your clients kind of throw out data after you've done this entire quality screening? Or they have different standards, different takes on what a quality data set is?
So just to repeat the question, we have a quality control process, but are there instances in which the ultimate buyer of the data, the ultimate consumer of the data, may have different standards or don't like our standards and therefore make a determination to revise or throw out some of the data? I think that is possible. That tends not to be likely. Tends not to be the case in our instance because of specific kind of verticalization of the use cases. So we have a fairly clear understanding of who our customers are and the use cases, what they would see as being appropriate standards for quality, and then there are kind of industry standards for that. So for example, in the polling industry, there are certain metrics around callback rates and certain metrics to determine what is the quality of the data that I'm looking at. Now, in some instances, our quality standards are fundamentally different because the nature of what we do is different. The way that you dispatch, manage a large fleet of people to move around the city as opposed to putting a bunch of people in cars and then having other people check in on them, that kind of manual process in our instance, means that the metrics can be a little bit different, but they're fairly closely aligned with the intent and the expectation that the industry sets. This is one of the benefits, I think, for us anyway, of, at least in this model, being enterprise focused and B2B focused as opposed to a consumer application. Where in the consumer application, you log in, swipe a credit card, send people out to collect data on any topic that you may want. Once you start going into those other kind of use cases that you can't predict, understand, or manage, then you start sort of having a discrepancy between your understanding of the quality control and what the industry would expect, or the end user would expect. Cool. Well, I think we're about out of time, but happy to sort of chat with others as relevant after. Thanks so much.